The auctioneer's voice cut through the dry Kansas air like a rusted blade, and Oliver Bristol felt something inside his chest crack open the moment he saw her standing on that platform with her wrists bound in rope. The year was 1873, and the frontier town of Caldwell, Kansas, was not a gentle place. It sat at the very edge of civilization, pressed hard against the Cherokee Strip, and the men who passed through it carried with them the dust of 100 miles and the desperation of lives lived outside the reach of law and decency. Caldwell had a sheriff who spent most afternoons face down at the bar of the Silver Horn Saloon, a church without a preacher, and a population of souls who had come west either chasing something worth having or running from something too terrible to name. Oliver Bristol had arrived 6 months prior, trailing neither hope nor shame, only the quiet intention of buying 40 acres of grazing land and building something honest from nothing. He had spent the morning at the feed store, loading sacks of oats onto his wagon, when the crowd began to gather at the far end of Main Street near the old livery. Oliver was not a man given to crowds. He was 28 years old, broad in the shoulders with hands calloused from years of fence mending and rope work, and he had learned early in life that wherever men gathered in large numbers and grew loud, trouble was usually the guest of honor. He had intended to climb up onto his wagon seat and drive the 3 miles back to his land without a second glance. But then he heard her. Not her voice, not yet. He heard the crack of a man's laugh, the kind of laugh that had nothing of joy in it and everything of cruelty. And then he heard the ripple of jeering from the crowd, and something in the quality of that sound made his stomach turn over. He tied his horse to the post and walked toward the commotion with his hat pulled low. What he saw when he pushed through the outer ring of onlookers stopped him dead. There was a wooden platform that had been hastily constructed from old barn planks, and on it stood a woman in a torn calico dressed the color of faded cornflowers. Her dark hair had come half out of its braid and fell across one shoulder. Her hands were tied in front of her with a length of hemp rope, and she was standing very still with her chin lifted, looking out over the crowd with eyes the color of deep river water, brown and clear, and filled with a kind of quiet fury that Oliver had never seen on a human face before. She was not crying. She was not begging. She simply stood there as if she were somewhere else entirely, as if the noise and the leering and the flat cruelty of the morning had not the power to touch her. The man running the auction was a heavy-set fellow named Gerald Pratt, who operated what he called a labor placement service, but which every honest man in a 50-mile radius knew was something closer to bondage dressed up in paper and ink. Pratt had arrived in Caldwell 3 weeks prior with a wagon full of women he claimed were indentured servants who had signed contracts agreeing to work off debts. Oliver had heard the whispers at the feed store and the blacksmith's, and had felt the same low sickness he felt now, but he had told himself it was not his business, and had gone back to his fence line. Now he stood in the crowd and watched Gerald Pratt wave a thick hand at the woman on the platform and call out to the gathered men in a voice like a carnival barker's. "Clara Fletcher," Pratt announced, 23 years of age, healthy, capable, comes with a work contract of 18 months. Highest bid takes her. Oliver heard the name and it settled into him somehow, Clara Fletcher, as if his mind were filing it away in a place of importance. The bidding started. Oliver listened and felt the sickness deepen. The men calling out numbers were not looking for a cook or a housekeeper. He could see it in the way they looked at her, and in the things they said to their neighbors when they thought no one of conscience was within earshot. Clara Fletcher stood on that platform and did not flinch. She looked out over the heads of the crowd, and Oliver had the strange feeling that she was looking directly past every single one of them, all the way to the open prairie beyond the edge of town, as if she were mapping her escape in her mind. He counted the money in his coat pocket. He had $112, which was everything he had saved over the past 6 months, and which he had intended to put toward the deed for his land at the end of the month. The land agent, a man named Horace Dunbar, had been holding the property for him on a handshake agreement, and Oliver knew that if he did not pay by the 1st of October, Dunbar would sell it to the next man who came along with cash in hand. The bidding was at $70. Oliver pushed through the crowd to the front. He did not think about the land. He did not weigh the decision or reason with himself or consider his options. He simply raised his hand and said, $112. The crowd went quiet. Pratt squinted at him. Some of the other bidders turned around with expressions of surprise and irritation. One man, a thick-necked rancher named Burl Gaines, stared at Oliver with his jaw set hard and his eyes going flat and mean. Pratt recovered first. "Do I hear 115?" he called out. No one raised a hand. Burl Gaines was the richest man in the immediate vicinity, and he had been at 105, but Oliver had jumped over him by $7, and the crowd seemed to sense that the stranger in the brown duster was not a man who would be easily outbid further. "Sold," Pratt said, and pointed his gavel at Oliver. $112 to the man in the brown coat. Oliver walked to the platform and handed over every dollar he had. Pratt's assistant, a wiry fellow with ferret eyes, counted the bills twice and then handed Oliver a piece of paper that was supposed to be the contract. Oliver took it without reading it. He walked up the 2 steps to the platform, pulled a small pocket knife from his belt, and cut the rope from Clara Fletcher's wrists. She turned to look at him for the first time. Up close, her eyes were even more arresting than they had appeared from the crowd. They were dark brown with flecks of amber in them, and they were measuring him with an intelligence that was wholly unsettling. There was a red mark on each of her wrists from the rope. She rubbed one absently with her opposite hand but did not look away from him. "What do you intend to do with me?" she asked. Her voice was steady, low, and carried an accent that put him somewhere in the hill country of Tennessee, maybe Kentucky. "Nothing," Oliver said. "I intend to take you off this platform and drive you wherever you want to go." Something moved behind her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but a crack in the wall of wariness. "You spent your money just to do that?" "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him for another 3 seconds, then climbed down off the platform with her head high and Gerald Pratt sputtering behind them about the terms of the contract. Oliver turned back to Pratt. "This contract," he said, holding up the paper, "is going straight to the United States Marshal's office along with a detailed accounting of what I witnessed here today. You might want to be several counties away before that happens." Pratt's face went the color of old dough, and he began backing toward his wagon with the kind of speed that suggested he had been on the wrong end of a marshal's inquiry before. Oliver walked away from the platform with Clara Fletcher at his side, and the crowd parted around them. He could feel Burl Gaines' eyes on his back like a hot coal, but he did not turn around. He walked her to his wagon and helped her up onto the seat, and then he climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Oliver Bristol," he said, as he clicked the horse forward. "Clara Fletcher," she said, as if she were confirming something she had not quite decided about yet. They drove in silence for a minute while Caldwell's dusty Main Street receded behind them. Then Clara said, without looking at him, "You said you would take me wherever I want to go." "I did say that. I want to go to Wichita. I have a cousin there. Her name is Nell Hadley. If I can get to Nell, I will be all right." "Wichita is 50 miles north," Oliver said. "I know how far it is," Clara said. He looked at her sidelong and felt the corner of his mouth pull upward slightly in spite of himself. "I know you do," he said. "I only meant that it will take 2 days with the wagon and I am heading the other direction, but I will take you." She turned to look at him then, and the measuring quality had returned to her eyes, searching for the trick in his offer, the hidden price. "I don't have any money," she said plainly. "I cannot pay you. I did not ask you to." Another silence, longer this time, and the open prairie spread out before them, golden and vast under the October sun, the tall grass bending in the wind, the sky a blue so deep it looked like something you could fall into. Clara put her hands in her lap and looked out at all of it, and Oliver thought he saw some of the tension leave her shoulders. "How did you come to be on that platform?" he asked, because he thought she might want someone to ask. She drew a slow breath. My father died 2 years ago. My mother had passed before him. I was working at a boarding house in Abilene, doing laundry and cooking, and I had saved enough to come west and start fresh somewhere. I met a woman in Abilene who said she ran a domestic placement agency and could find me a good position in a household in the territories. She charged me $30 for the placement and gave me a contract to sign. Clara paused. I did not read the contract carefully enough. By the time I understood what it said, I was in a wagon heading for Caldwell with 4 other women in the same situation. Oliver kept his eyes on the trail ahead. Who was the woman in Abilene? She called herself Mrs. Adler. I suspect that was not her real name. And the 4 other women, are they still with Pratt? Clara's jaw tightened. 3 of them were sold before I was. I do not know where they went. One woman, a girl named Frances, she managed to get away somewhere between Abilene and Caldwell. I hope she is safe. I have thought about her every day. Oliver filed that away. He would go to the marshal in Wichita when he brought Clara there, and he would tell them everything, including the name Mrs. Adler and the name Gerald Pratt and every detail he could recall about the wagon and the contract. They drove until the sun was halfway down the sky and stopped beside a creek lined with cottonwoods to water the horse and eat what Oliver had in his pack, which was not much. Hardtack, dried beef, a tin of peaches he had bought as a small indulgence at the feed store that morning. He opened the tin of peaches with his knife and handed it to Clara without ceremony. She ate slowly, the way people ate when they had not had enough recently, making sure each bite counted. Then she handed the tin back with 2 pieces of peach still in the syrup. "Finish it," he said. "You need to eat too." "I had breakfast," he said, which was true but not the whole truth, because he had not had a meal as full as a tin of peaches since the week prior. She looked at him with that same measuring quality. Then she handed the tin back again and said, "Split it." He split it. They made camp that night on the high ground above the creek, Oliver rolling out his blanket by the fire and giving Clara the bedroll from the wagon bed. The night came in cold and clear, full of stars spread edge to edge across the sky, and they sat for a time on either side of the fire without speaking, which was its own kind of conversation. "You had money saved," Clara said eventually. "You spent it on that auction." "I did." "What were you saving it for?" He considered whether to answer honestly and decided there was no reason not to. "Land. There are 40 acres south of Caldwell with good grass and a spring on the northwest corner. I have been saving 6 months to buy the deed." "I was supposed to pay at the end of the month." Clara went still. "You lost your land for me." "I made a choice," he said. "That is not a small thing, Oliver Bristol." He looked across the fire at her, and the firelight did something remarkable to her face, softening the lines of strain that the day had cut into it, and he had the strange feeling again, the same one that had hit him when the auctioneer said her name, that this woman was going to matter to him in ways he did not yet have words for. "No," he said, "it is not a small thing." She looked back into the fire and was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I will pay you back. You do not need to do that." "I will pay you back," she said again firmly, and he understood that this was not negotiable for her, that it had something to do with how she saw herself and what she owed and what she could carry. So he said nothing more about it. In the morning they broke camp before the sun was fully up and pushed north along the Kisham Trail, which was well-traveled enough to leave ruts in the hard earth but quiet at this hour, the great herds that would have crowded it in summer already long since delivered to the rail pens. Clara rode beside him on the wagon seat with a borrowed blanket around her shoulders against the morning cold, and she asked him questions about himself. Not idly, but with genuine attention, listening to his answers as if she were building something from the materials he gave her. She learned that he had been born in Ohio, that he had come west at 19 with a cattle drive and never gone back, that he had worked ranches from Texas to Colorado before deciding he wanted land of his own. She learned that he had a brother named Thomas who had gone to California and whom he heard from twice a year by letter. She learned that he could fix a wagon axle and deliver a calf and read well enough to get through a newspaper, and that the last book he had read was a worn copy of David Copperfield that he had traded a pair of spurs for at a bookseller's stall in Dodge City. In return, she told him about the hill country of eastern Tennessee where she had grown up, the smell of wood smoke, and the sound of her mother singing while she worked, the creek behind the house where she had learned to catch crawdads with her bare hands. She told him her father had been a schoolteacher, which explained the precision in her speech and the sharpness in her thinking. She had studied alongside his students and could read Latin, which Oliver found so unexpected and delightful that he laughed out loud, a real laugh, and she smiled for the first time, and that smile did something to the interior landscape of his chest that he was not entirely prepared for. They arrived in Wichita on the second afternoon, coming in along the Arkansas River with the town spread before them in the hard, flat light, busier and louder than Caldwell, full of the noise of the cattle trade even in October with the season winding down. Oliver drove straight to the marshal's office and spent an hour inside giving a full account to a deputy named Marcus Cole, who took careful notes and said that Gerald Pratt was already known to them by a different name and that they would act on the information. Oliver gave him the contract as evidence and described Mrs. Adler in as much detail as Clara could provide. When they came out into the street, Clara stood blinking in the afternoon light, and there was something in her posture that was different from when he had first seen her, something looser, as if a wire that had been pulled tight inside her had been given a quarter turn of slack. "Thank you for doing that," she said. "For the other women. I hope it helps them," he said. They found Nell Hadley's address from a man at the dry goods store who knew the Hadley family, and Oliver drove them to a small but well-kept house near the edge of town, where a woman of about 26 came to the door and looked at Clara for exactly 2 seconds before the tears started, and she pulled her cousin inside with both arms. Oliver stood at the wagon and was turning to climb up when Clara came back to the door. "Wait," she said. He waited. She came down the 2 porch steps and walked up to him and held out her hand. He took it and she shook it firmly, meeting his eyes. "You gave up everything you had. I want you to know that I understand what that means and I will not forget it." He nodded, not quite trusting himself to speak. "Where will you go now?" she asked. "Back to Caldwell, I suppose. Talk to Horace Dunbar about the land, see if there is another arrangement to be made." "Is there any chance of it?" "Some," he said, which was a more optimistic assessment than the one he had made in private. "I am good with cattle. I can hire on with a ranch for the winter and save again." She looked at him for a long moment. "Come inside," she said. "Nell will want to thank you and you should eat a proper meal before you drive back." He hesitated. "I do not want to impose." "You will not be imposing," she said, and her tone was such that arguing with it would have felt foolish. So he tied the horse to Nell's porch post and followed her inside. Nell Hadley turned out to be a warm and practical woman who ran a small dressmaking business from the front room of her house, and who expressed her gratitude in the form of a full supper of roasted chicken, boiled potatoes, and fresh bread that made Oliver feel like a man who had been living in a cave coming suddenly into a lit room. Her husband, a quiet man named Samuel Hadley who worked at the grain elevator, shook Oliver's hand with a grip that communicated more than words and said simply, "You are welcome in this house whenever you pass through." Oliver left Wichita the next morning early, before the household was fully awake, which felt cleaner than a drawn-out farewell. He had said his goodbyes the night before, and had told himself with great conviction that the matter was concluded, and that he would not spend the long drive home thinking about Clara Fletcher's amber-flecked eyes. He spent the entire long drive home thinking about Clara Fletcher's amber-flecked eyes. He arrived back in Caldwell in the late afternoon, returned his horse to the stable, and went directly to find Horace Dunbar. Dunbar was a lean man in his 50s with a tobacco-stained mustache and a disappointingly businesslike manner. He had already received an offer on the 40 acres from Burl Gaines. Oliver stood in Dunbar's office and absorbed this information with the calm that a man develops after years of setbacks and said, "Give me until spring." Dunbar scratched his chin. Gaines is ready to pay cash now. I know he is, Oliver said. What is your asking price? 145, same as always. I will hire on at the Circle H for the winter. They are bringing in a large remuda for the spring drive, and I know horses. By April I will have the money. Dunbar looked at him for a while. Burl Gaines is not a man who takes being outmaneuvered kindly, Oliver. He was at that auction, and I heard he was none too happy about what happened. I imagine he was not. He is the kind of man who holds a grudge long enough to grow old with it. I am aware of that. Dunbar sighed and picked up his pen. April 1st. If you do not have the money by April 1st, the property goes to Gaines. That is the best I can do for you. That is fair, Oliver said, and shook his hand. He hired on at the Circle H ranch the following week. The work was familiar and punishing in the way that good physical labor always is, and Oliver was grateful for it, because it left him too tired in the evenings for too much thinking. He broke horses through October and November, worked the fence lines through December's bitter cold, and helped manage the feed inventory through January when the blizzards came down off the plains and covered the Kansas grassland in a white silence, so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. He wrote a letter to Clara in late October, partly because he had told her he would let her know how the land situation resolved, and partly because not writing it had proven impossible after about 2 weeks. He kept the letter brief and factual. He told her about the arrangement with Dunbar and about hiring at the Circle H. He mentioned that the marshal's office had sent word that Gerald Pratt had been located and detained in Dodge City and was facing charges, and that 2 of the 3 women sold before Clara had been identified and were being assisted. He said he hoped Wichita was treating her well. He was not sure the letter would reach her. He addressed it to Clara Fletcher, care of Mrs. Nell Hadley, Wichita, Kansas, and gave it to the mail rider with no real expectation of an answer. Her reply came 3 weeks later and was considerably longer than his letter. She wrote in a hand that was precise and expressive at the same time, the letters of a person who had been well taught and who found satisfaction in words. She told him that she had found work at a millinery shop in Wichita, that she was learning the trade quickly, and that Mrs. Patterson, the shop's owner, had declared her an asset, which Clara wrote with a trace of dry humor that came through even in ink. She said that the news about Pratt and the other women was a relief she could not adequately describe. She asked about the horse-breaking work and whether he had been thrown recently, which made him smile. She said that the October sky over Wichita looked, on clear days, exactly like the sky over the Tennessee hills of her childhood, and that she was grateful for the similarity. She did not mention the money she owed him, and neither did he. He wrote back. She wrote back. By December they were exchanging letters every 2 weeks, and Oliver was spending more time on his letters than he had spent on any single task in recent memory, which was an illuminating fact about his interior life that he chose not to examine too directly. He told himself it was simple correspondence, 2 people who had shared an unusual circumstance staying in touch. He told himself this with decreasing conviction as the months went on, and he found himself reading her letters more than once, and then folding them carefully and putting them in the small tin box he kept under his bunk. In January, she wrote something that stopped him for a long time. She had been describing the millinery shop and its customers and the things she was learning about the fashions of the day, and then she had written, "I think sometimes about the fire on the trail and how it felt to sit across from someone who asked me nothing and offered everything. I do not know precisely what to do with that thought, so I am giving it to you to keep instead." He sat with that letter in his hands for a full hour before he wrote back, and when he did, he said, "I will keep it carefully." The winter deepened, and the work at the Circle H was hard enough to satisfy a man who needed satisfaction in labor, but Oliver found himself increasingly restless in the evenings, in a way he had not been before September. The bunkhouse was full of men who were good company in the rough and intermittent way of bunkhouse society, card games and tall stories, and the occasional heated disagreement over nothing in particular. But Oliver had developed a disinclination for the noise of other people that he recognized as a symptom of something he had not yet named to himself. February brought a development he had not anticipated. Burl Gaines' foreman, a man named Len Prout, rode up to the Circle H one afternoon and found Oliver at the corral and informed him with very little pretense that Mr. Gaines was prepared to offer Oliver a position at the Gaines Ranch at considerably higher wages than the Circle H was paying, on the condition that Oliver's land claim be abandoned. Oliver looked at Prout for a long moment in the cold afternoon light with his breath misting in front of him and the horses shifting restlessly behind the fence. "Tell Mr. Gaines no," Oliver said. Prout smiled the particular smile of a man delivering bad news that he personally enjoys. "He thought you might say that. He also wanted me to mention that he does not forget when someone costs him money." "I know what he wanted," Oliver said, "and I know what I want. Tell him no." Prout rode away and Oliver went back to the corral, but the conversation sat in his mind like a stone in a boot. Gaines was a man of genuine means, and he had a long history of getting what he wanted in Caldwell County by whatever method was required. Oliver had heard enough about him over the past months to know that the job offer was the polite opening move in a game that would not stay polite. He wrote to Clara that evening and told her about Prout's visit, not to alarm her but because he had gotten into the habit of telling her things, and the habit had become something he did not want to give up. He tried to write it lightly, as an anecdote rather than a worry. Her response came back faster than usual and was shorter and more direct than her typical letters. She wrote, "Be careful, Oliver. Men like the one you describe do not make one polite offer and then quietly go away." And then, below that, as if she had written it and thought about crossing it out and decided not to, "I would like very much for you to be all right." He read that line several times. Then he got up, put on his coat, and walked out into the February dark where the stars were very bright and the wind was coming down hard from the north. And he stood there for a while feeling something large and warm expanding in his chest that had very little to do with the cold, and very much to do with a woman in Wichita who read too quickly and smelled of lavender, and would smoke and spoke with the precision of her schoolteacher father. He was in love with her. He had known it for some time in the way you know a thing before you have words for it, the way the body understands what the mind is still arguing about. He stood in the February dark and let himself know it clearly for the first time and felt both the terror and the relief of it, the way the truth always carries both. March came in wild, with storms that rattled the bunkhouse walls and turned the roads to mud. Oliver worked through it with the kind of focused energy that comes from having a clear objective and a fixed deadline. By the middle of March, he had saved $108, which was not yet enough, and which required either another 3 weeks of wages or a supplementary plan. The supplementary plan presented itself in the form of a horse trader named Pete Caldwell, no relation to the town, who came through the area in mid-March with 3 horses he needed broken and a willingness to pay well for fast work. Oliver spent 6 days working those horses in addition to his Circle H duties, sleeping about 4 hours a night and eating whatever was quickest. And by the end of it, his body felt like it had been taken apart and reassembled slightly wrong. But he had $35 more, and the total was more than enough. He paid Horace Dunbar on the 28th of March, 4 days before the deadline, and walked out of Dunbar's office with the deed to 40 acres in his coat pocket and a feeling in his chest like a bell being rung. He stood on the main street of Caldwell in the March afternoon with mud on his boots and the deed in his pocket and knew exactly what he wanted to do next. He went to the telegraph office and sent a wire to Wichita. It read, "Got the land. Coming to Wichita if that is all right. Have something to ask you, Oliver Bristol." He waited 3 hours in the telegraph office while old Mr. Crane looked at him with a patience that bordered on amusement. The reply came, "It is all right. Clara Fletcher." He arrived in Wichita on a Thursday, having pushed the wagon hard for 2 days, which left him arriving at Nell Hadley's door with mud-spattered boots and several days of beard, and the general appearance of a man who had not prioritized his presentation. Clara opened the door and looked at him and laughed, which was a sound he had not yet heard at full volume, unguarded and genuine, low and a little startled, and it was so entirely wonderful that he felt slightly stunned. "You look terrible," she said. "I know," he said. "I came anyway." She stepped back from the door and let him in. Nell was tactfully absent, having apparently developed an urgent errand, and Oliver sat at the kitchen table while Clara put coffee on, and they fell into conversation as easily as if the months of letters had been practiced for just this moment. The warm domestic reality of it, sitting in a kitchen with the smell of coffee rising, and the sound of the street outside, and Clara moving around the small space with the assurance of someone who knows where everything belongs. He asked her to walk with him after the coffee, and she said yes, putting on her coat and a pair of sensible boots, and they walked along the river in the March cold with the cottonwoods just beginning to show the first ghost of green at the tips of their branches. He told her about the land, about the spring on the northwest corner, and the way the grass grew thick there even in dry years. About how he intended to build a house, not large, but with good windows to let in the light and a porch facing west for the sunsets. He told her about it with a specificity that probably gave away more than he intended about how long he had been imagining it. Clara walked beside him with her hands in her coat pockets and listened, and when he stopped she looked at the river for a moment and then said, "What did you want to ask me?" He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The river moved past them, brown and cold, and a red-tailed hawk made a wide circle overhead against the white March sky. "I am not a man of many words when it comes to things that matter," he said. "But you matter to me, Clara. You have mattered to me since the moment you looked out over that crowd, and did not let any of it touch you. I have not stopped thinking about you since September, and the letters have been the best part of my winter, and I know that what I am about to say is significant, and I know that I have no right to any particular answer, but I need to ask." Clara was looking at him steadily. There was something in her expression that was very still, the way water goes still before something large happens in it. "Will you come to Caldwell with me?" he said. "Not to work or to repay anything, because you owe me nothing, please understand that. But because I would like to build that house with windows, and I would like it very much if you would be in it. With me. If you would consider becoming my wife, Clara, I believe I would spend the rest of my life being grateful for it." The hawk made another circle. The river moved. The cottonwoods breathed their first green breath of spring. Clara looked at him for a long moment with those amber-flecked eyes. He could see things moving through them, thought and feeling, and the careful architecture of a woman who had learned to weigh her choices because the wrong ones had cost her dearly. "You know almost nothing about me," she said finally. "I know you stand on platforms with your chin up," he said. "I know you read Latin and catch crawdads with your bare hands, and that you give back the last 2 pieces of peach because you think it is fair. I know you think about Francis every day and that you find the Kansas sky comforting because it looks like home. I know that you write letters that I read more than once. I believe I know what matters." Clara looked at the river. Her jaw moved slightly as if she were working something through. "I told you I would pay you back," she said. "Clara." "I mean," she said, and her voice had changed, gotten quieter and more careful, "that I am not the kind of woman who can accept something so large as what you did without finding a way to balance it. It would always sit between us otherwise. So here is what I think. I think I need to know that what you feel is real and not just the feeling of having done a good thing and then being curious about the person you did it for." He considered this seriously, because she deserved a serious answer. "I have thought about that too," he said. "I have asked myself more than once if what I feel is something genuine or something simpler, and here is what I know. When Prout came to the Circle H and I wrote to tell you about it, the part of the letter I cared about most was not the information. It was the fact that I was telling it to you. That is not curiosity about a good deed. That is something else. She turned from the river and looked at him directly. "I have been in Wichita for 6 months," she said. "I have worked hard and saved money, and I have not once thought about the future without putting you somewhere in the picture of it, which frightened me considerably and which I have done my best to ignore. I am not very good at ignoring things that are true." Something opened up in his chest, wide and warm and full of light. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "That is a yes," she said. He took her hand from her coat pocket where it had been hiding, and she let him, and they stood by the river in the cold March afternoon holding hands like two people who had found each other by the strangest and most necessary of accidents. And the hawk made one more circle, and then turned south on the wind and was gone. They were married 3 weeks later in the small white church on the edge of Wichita. A simple ceremony with Nell and Samuel Hadley as witnesses, and a preacher named Reverend Marsh who had a habit of crying at his own ceremonies, which he did not attempt to conceal. Clara wore a dress that Nell had helped her make, a soft gray wool with buttons down the front and a collar of cream-colored lace, and she carried a handful of early prairie wildflowers that Oliver had gone out at dawn to find, which she did not know about until he pressed them into her hands outside the church door. She looked at the flowers and then at him. "You got up before dawn for these," she said. "They are mostly dandelions," he admitted. "They are perfect," she said, and she meant it with her whole face. Reverend Marsh wept. Nell wept. Samuel shook Oliver's hand again with the same wordless conviction as before. Oliver looked at his wife standing in the church doorway in the April light with her dandelions, and felt the complete and specific satisfaction of a man who has ended up exactly where he was supposed to be. They drove back to Caldwell together in the last week of April, which was the right time for it, when the prairie was coming alive in every direction, the grass coming in thick and green after the winter, the wildflowers coming up along the creek banks, the sky doing the elaborate theatrical thing it does in spring when it cannot quite decide between sunshine and storms and ends up being both at once. Clara rode beside him on the wagon seat and looked out at all of it with an expression of quiet wonder. "It is different than Tennessee," she said. "There are no hills. Does that bother you?" "No," she said. "I think I might love it. There is so much room for the sky." He had arranged for temporary lodging with a widow named Mrs. Oates who ran a clean and quiet boarding house at the southern end of Caldwell, and they stayed there while he began work on the house. He had hired 2 men from the settlement to help with the frame, brothers named Walt and Cecil Greer, who worked with the efficient silence of men who preferred lumber to conversation. And Clara drove out to the property every morning to watch the progress and sometimes to hand tools or hold boards or offer opinions on window placement that Oliver took seriously and incorporated. The house went up through May. It was not large, as Oliver had said, but it was well built with a deep front porch facing west and windows on every wall that made the interior feel full of air and light. There were 2 rooms to start, a main room with a fireplace and a kitchen behind it, and a small bedroom with a window that faced east so that the morning sun came in first thing and woke you gently. Burl Gaines made his presence known in May in a way that was unpleasant but not violent. 3 of Oliver's fence posts were pulled up in the night, which was a message more than a material damage. Oliver drove to the Gaines ranch the next morning and was refused entry at the gate by Prout, who delivered the message that Mr. Gaines would be watching the situation and that the Bristol property would require a considerable amount of watching for a long time. Oliver drove home, told Clara about it without embellishing, and they sat at the table in Mrs. Oates' boarding house and thought about it together. "He wants you unsettled," Clara said. "Yes, and he is going to keep doing small things until either you leave or you do something that gives him a legal advantage. That is my reading of it." Clara put her hands flat on the table. "Then we will not be unsettled," she said. "We will build the house and start the herd and become the kind of neighbors who are too established to push around. And we will make sure the sheriff and every other person of significance in this county understands that we intend to stay." Oliver looked at her across the table. "You are very good at this," he said, My father used to say that the best response to a bully is to grow roots so deep he cannot pull you up, she said. I think it is sound advice. They followed the advice. Oliver bought 12 cattle from a rancher to the east who was reducing his herd and built a small corral. Clara established a kitchen garden behind the house the moment the floors were laid, planting vegetables with the focused determination of a woman declaring occupation of territory. They introduced themselves to every neighbor within a 10-mile radius, and Clara charmed all of them with a combination of genuine warmth and her father's precise courtesy. And within 2 months, they were woven into the fabric of the surrounding community in a way that made Gaines' hostility look increasingly like the petty grievance it was. Gaines tried twice more over the summer, once by complaining to Dunbar that Oliver's eastern fence line encroached on a strip of land that Gaines claimed for himself, which a formal survey disproved entirely, and once by spreading a rumor in town that Oliver's cattle were diseased, which was so obviously false that it produced more goodwill toward Oliver than harm, as the neighbors who investigated found a healthy herd and a man who invited them to look at anything they liked. After the second failure, Gaines seemed to decide that his energy was better spent elsewhere, and the harassment dwindled. Oliver never entirely relaxed his watchfulness, but as the summer turned to autumn, the situation had arrived at something close to ordinary peace. The house was finished in June, and they moved in on a bright Saturday with the prairie full of summer heat and the sound of the meadowlarks coming from the tall grass on every side. There was not much to move. Oliver's possessions were the contents of a saddlebag and a wooden chest. Clara had a trunk that had been sent from Wichita with her clothing and her books, of which there were several, and a small mirror in a carved wooden frame that had been her mother's. She hung the mirror in the bedroom on the wall beside the east window, and the morning light caught it and threw a bright spot on the opposite wall. "There," she said, stepping back to look at it. "There," Oliver agreed from the doorway. She turned and looked at him with a smile that was different from the ones he had seen before, quieter and more internal, the smile of a person who has arrived somewhere. He crossed the room and took her face in both his hands, carefully, the way you handle something you know is valuable, and kissed her, and she put her hands on his chest and kissed him back, and outside the meadowlarks went on singing in the tall grass as if the world were simply and completely good. They found their rhythm together in the way that two people do when they are genuinely suited to each other and are willing to be honest about the friction that still comes up. Clara was meticulous about certain things, the arrangement of the kitchen, the way accounts were kept, and she had strong opinions about the reading matter available in the house, which grew steadily as she found books at the dry goods store and the occasional wagon of a passing trader. Oliver was less meticulous in general and more patient with disorder, which created a complementary dynamic that mostly worked and occasionally produced spirited discussions about whether the harness should be hung on the left or right side of the barn door. He loved those discussions. He loved hearing her argue clearly for her position, and he loved the way she listened when he argued for his, and he loved that they could end the argument and eat supper together without either of them carrying resentment across the table. He had not known before Clara that a marriage could operate this way, as a thing between two people who were genuinely interested in each other's thinking, and the discovery of it was one of the continual pleasures of his days. In October, a year after the auction that had started all of it, Clara told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the evening on the front porch, both of them in the wooden chairs Oliver had built over the summer, the sky going through its western spectacular of orange and deep rose, and she said it directly in her precise Tennessee voice, "I am going to have a baby, Oliver. Sometime in the spring, I think." He looked at her. She was watching the sky, but he could see the slight tension in her hands where they rested on the arms of the chair, the effort of the casual delivery, the vulnerability underneath it. "Clara," he said. She turned to look at him. He had no words that felt equal to it, so he took her hand from the arm of the chair and held it in both of his, and the look on his face must have said whatever was needed because the tension went out of her hands and she smiled, slow and full, and turned back to the sky. "A spring baby," he said. "On a cattle ranch, good timing." She laughed. "I thought you would say something like that. Is that all right?" "It is the best possible response," she said. The winter of 1873 into 1874 was cold and long, and Oliver worked the ranch through it with the steady, methodical determination that had become his characteristic approach to everything. And Clara ran the household with an organizing intelligence that made the small house feel efficient and warm. And in the evenings they sat by the fire and she read to him from whatever book was current, and he mended whatever needed mending, and the snow came down outside, and the fire crackled, and the dog they had acquired from a passing cattle drive, a heavy brown dog of no determinable breeding whom they called Judge, lay on the hearth rug and sighed with the contentment of an animal who has found his people. Clara wrote a letter to Nell in December and told her about the baby, and Nell wrote back at length with advice, reassurance, and the news that Frances, the young woman who had escaped from Pratt's wagon, had been located in Lawrence, Kansas, and was doing well, and had found work in decent lodgings, which was the best news of the year, and which Clara read aloud to Oliver by the fire with her voice going unsteady in the middle and having to stop. The spring came, as it always does, with mud first and then the miraculous transformation of the plains into something green and enormous and alive. In April, when the wildflowers were coming up along the creek bank, and the cattle were moving restlessly at the smell of new grass, Clara went into labor on a Tuesday morning with a calm that Oliver found both admirable and privately terrifying. He sent for the woman who served as Caldwell's midwife, a capable widow named Mrs. Eugenia Stark, and Mrs. Stark arrived and took charge of the situation with the brisk authority of a woman who had seen every kind of birth and was not impressed by any variety of male anxiety. She stationed Oliver on the front porch with firm instructions to stay there and bring water when asked and otherwise to hold his peace. He sat on the front porch and listened to the sounds of the house and watched the prairie do its spring business in every direction and held his peace with great difficulty. Their son was born in the early afternoon, loud and vigorous, with Oliver's dark hair and Clara's precise, expressive features, and Mrs. Stark brought him out to the porch wrapped in a piece of flannel before Oliver was allowed inside. And Oliver held him for the first time in the April sunlight with the meadowlarks going and the new grass bending in the wind, and felt the whole world rearrange itself around this small, furious, extraordinary fact. He went inside. Clara was sitting up in the bed with her hair down and her face exhausted and luminous, and she looked at him standing in the doorway holding their son and said, "Well, he is remarkable," Oliver said. "He is very loud," she said. "That is how you know he is healthy," Oliver said, which was something Mrs. Stark had told him and which he repeated now with full conviction. They named him James Thomas Bristol, James for Clara's father and Thomas for Oliver's brother. Thomas Bristol received the news by letter in California and replied with what was, for Thomas, a practically effusive response. A full page of congratulations and a promise to come east within the year to meet his nephew. A promise he actually kept, arriving in the autumn of 1874 with a traveling companion who turned out to be his wife, a cheerful red-haired woman named Adelaide who took to Clara immediately, and spent a week in the farmhouse talking with a speed and enthusiasm that left Oliver and Thomas blinking in their wake. The autumn of 1874 was a good one. The cattle had done well over the summer, and Oliver had sold at decent prices to the rail pens, and had enough to expand the herd modestly and make improvements to the barn that had been needed since spring. Clara's kitchen garden had produced in abundance, and she had spent August putting up preserves and drying herbs with a focused pleasure that made the kitchen smell extraordinary for weeks. James sat on a blanket in the sunshine and observed all of this with the grave attention of a very young person who is taking detailed notes on the nature of existence. One afternoon in October, exactly 2 years after the auction, Oliver was working on the corral fence when he looked up and saw Clara coming across the yard from the kitchen garden with her apron full of late squash and the sun behind her and the dog trotting alongside her. And she was talking to James, who was balanced on her hip looking at the squash with his solemn, analytical expression. And she was explaining something to him about the different varieties with the same precise enthusiasm she brought to every subject. Oliver stopped working and just looked at them for a moment. He thought about the man he had been 2 years ago, standing in a crowd in Caldwell with $112 in his pocket and no clear idea of what he intended, only the absolute inability to do nothing. He thought about the platform and the rope and the woman with her chin lifted and her river water eyes, and he thought about the fire on the trail and the tin of peaches split 2 ways, and the letters in their tin box under the bunk, and the dandelions before the church door, and the mirror in the bedroom catching the morning light. Clara looked up and saw him looking and stopped walking. Something in his expression must have communicated itself clearly across the yard, because her face changed, becoming softer and more open, the expression she reserved for him in their private moments, the face beneath all the competence and the precision and the self-sufficiency. "What?" she called across the yard. "Nothing," he called back. "Everything is exactly right." She shook her head at him in the way she did when she thought he was being sentimental, which always came accompanied by the corner of her mouth lifting, and walked on toward the kitchen door, saying something to James that made him look back at Oliver over her shoulder with his father's dark eyes. Oliver went back to the fence. The October sun was warm on his back and the cattle were moving slowly through the far grass, and the sky was exactly the blue it should be, the blue that stretched from horizon to horizon without a single obstruction, the great arching fact of the prairie sky that Clara had said on their first spring drive had so much room in it for everything. She was right. It did. The winter of 1874 to 1875 passed with James learning to pull himself to standing by holding onto things, and then letting go with an expression of profound surprise every single time, as if gravity were a new and unreliable acquaintance. Clara taught school 2 mornings a week in the winter months, an arrangement she had organized with 3 neighboring families whose children had no other schooling available, and she carried James to school in a sling she had made from good wool, and taught her students with him asleep on her chest, or regarding the proceedings from a blanket in the corner. The neighboring families repaid her in eggs and preserves and labor, and one of the fathers, a Swedish farmer named Eric Lindqvist, helped Oliver build an extension on the barn that spring in exchange for Clara's continued teaching through the summer. Oliver watched his wife manage all of this, the school and the household and the garden and the accounts and the care of their son, with the same organized energy she had brought to everything, and he felt on a daily basis the specific gratitude of a man who knows he is fortunate, and has the good sense to recognize it as such rather than treating it as routine. He told her this one evening when James was asleep, and they were sitting by the fire with the last of the winter going on outside. "You know that I think about September 1873 most days," he said. She looked at him from across the fire. "Do you?" "I do. I think about what would have happened if I had not walked toward the crowd. If I had climbed up on the wagon and driven home." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I have thought about that too," she said, "more times than I care to count. I am glad I walked toward it." "So am I," she said simply. "So am I, Oliver." He leaned forward in his chair and held out his hand, and she took it across the space between them, and they sat like that with the fire going and the wind outside and James breathing softly in the bedroom, and Judge sighing on the hearth rug, held in the warm, specific gravity of a life built together from an unlikely beginning. Spring of 1875 came, and with it the news that Gerald Pratt had been tried in Dodge City and sentenced to 3 years in the federal penitentiary, and that the woman who had been operating as Mrs. Adler, whose real name turned out to be Harriet Coombs, had been identified and charged as well. Deputy Marcus Cole, who had taken their statements in Wichita nearly 2 years before, sent a note informing Clara that her testimony and Oliver's had been materially important to the prosecution's case. Clara read the note at the kitchen table and was still for a long time. "It is over," she said. "It is over," Oliver said. She folded the note and put it in the tin box that now held both their letters from the beginning and the important papers of their life together. "For us," she said, "for all the women who were not as fortunate, it is not over in the same way." "No," he said, "it is not." They sat with that truth honestly, not trying to paper over it with easy comfort, because Clara was not a woman who accepted easy comfort on things that warranted honesty. Then she said, "I would like to do something. I am not sure what yet. Something that helps women who are in the situation I was in. I want to think about what that could look like out here." "Then we will think about it," Oliver said. She did think about it, with characteristic thoroughness, and by summer she had organized a practical response. She wrote to the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was active in Kansas and involved in advocacy for women's welfare, and made contact with a network of women who were doing similar work in the territory. She began corresponding with 2 women in Wichita who ran a small home for women in crisis, sending them what money they could spare from the household accounts and writing detailed, practical letters about what women in the frontier settlements most needed. It was not a large thing, not yet, but it was a beginning, and Clara attacked beginnings with a methodical energy that Oliver had learned to recognize as the first stage of something that would eventually become significant. The cattle herd had grown to 32 by the autumn of 1875, which represented genuine progress, and Oliver hired a young ranch hand named Bobby Sanchez, 19 years old and practically made of cheerful competence, who had been working drives since he was 15 and could read cattle the way other men read books. Bobby lived in the bunkhouse Oliver had built the previous spring and ate supper with the family on Sundays and taught James, who was now 1.5 and aggressively mobile, an impressive array of sounds that may or may not have been Spanish words, which delighted Clara and kept Oliver in a state of mild alarm about what James might eventually say in public. The autumn of 1875 was when Clara told him about the second baby. She told him in the kitchen this time, in the practical light of a Wednesday morning with bread in the oven, and James occupied with a wooden horse Bobby had carved for him. "Another spring baby," she said, with the same quality of deliberate calm she had used the first time. Oliver sat down at the kitchen table. James looked up from the wooden horse, seemed to determine that whatever was happening did not require his attention, and went back to his investigation. "Are you all right?" Oliver said. "I am very well," Clara said. "I have done this before, after all." "You have," he said. "But I have not yet managed to be calm about it, and I suspect I will not be this time either." She put a hand on his shoulder as she passed behind him to check the bread. "You can be calm on the porch again," she said. "Mrs. Stark will not mind." He laughed, and she laughed with him, and James made a sound that was probably an opinion. The winter of 1875 to 1876 was mild by Kansas standards, which everyone acknowledged as a mercy. Oliver expanded the herd again in January, buying 10 more cattle from a rancher in the next county who was selling out to move his family to Oregon. He thought about that man, packing up 40 years of his life into wagons and pointing them westward again, and felt the deep rootedness of his own intention to stay, here on this particular 40 acres with its spring on the northwest corner, and the meadowlarks in the tall grass and the west-facing porch where he and Clara watched the sky come apart in color every evening. He had roots now, deeper than the fence posts, deeper than the well he had dug in the first summer. They went down through the soil of the place into something he could not have named precisely, but which had everything to do with the woman inside the house and the child underfoot, and the life they had made here, specific and honest and hard one. Nell and Samuel Hadley came from Wichita in March, Nell large with her own first pregnancy, and moving with the careful deliberation of a woman doing important work. She and Clara sat at the kitchen table for hours and talked, and Oliver and Samuel sat on the porch and did not talk very much at all, which was its own comfortable thing. And by the time the Hadleys drove back to Wichita, there was a warmth in the house that stayed for days after their wagon disappeared up the road. Their second child was born on a Thursday morning in May, while the prairie outside was at its most extravagant, the wildflowers and the new grass and the sky performing their annual spectacle of abundance. Oliver was again stationed on the porch by Mrs. Stark, who was beginning to regard this as their particular tradition, and Bobby Sanchez found very important fence work to do at the far end of the property and stayed there until summoned. The child was a girl, which Oliver had not allowed himself to predict, and she arrived in the world with a great deal less noise than James had made, but with an intensity of expression that suggested she was simply more thoughtful about her objections than her brother. Mrs. Stark brought her out in the same flannel wrap, different flannel but the same tradition, and Oliver held her on the porch in the May sunshine, and she looked up at him with eyes that were Clara's eyes exactly, dark brown and already measuring. He went inside. Clara looked at him from the bed. "A daughter," he said. "I know," she said. "I was there." He laughed. Even now, even exhausted and just finished with the considerable business of producing a new human being, she made him laugh. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she leaned into him, and they looked at their daughter, who had quieted and was regarding both of them with her deep, considering gaze. "Eleanor," Clara said. "I would like to call her Eleanor, my mother's name." "Oliver Bristol," Oliver said, and tested the weight of it. "Yes." James was introduced to his sister that afternoon with the cautious suspicion of a 22-month-old confronted with an unexpected development, and he stood beside the bed looking at Eleanor for a long time with his precise, analytical expression before apparently reaching some internal conclusion about her acceptability and going back to his wooden horse. Bobby Sanchez came to the kitchen door that evening holding his hat and looking simultaneously delighted and overwhelmed in the way of a 19-year-old confronted with new babies, and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Bristol, Mrs. Bristol," in a voice that cracked slightly on Bristol, and then retreated to the bunkhouse and could be heard there celebrating in quiet Spanish. The spring of 1876 moved into summer with the full, busy momentum of a working ranch, and a household with 2 small children in it, which is to say that there was never a moment without purpose, and never a day that went quite as planned, and never an evening by the fire that was not the sweetest part of it. The children in bed and the dog on the rug, and the quiet between them that was full rather than empty. Clara's work with the Women's Network had grown by this time into something more organized. She was corresponding with women in 5 counties, and she had established a loose system by which women in dangerous situations could be directed to safe lodgings and practical assistance. It operated through the churches and the women's temperance societies and the informal networks of frontier women who were always, in Oliver's observation, considerably more organized than the men around them gave them credit for. Oliver supported this work with everything he could provide, which some seasons was money and some seasons was time, helping Clara write letters or drive to meetings in Caldwell or Wichita when she needed to be there. He had come to understand that her need to do this work was connected directly to the experience on that platform in September 1873, and that supporting it was not a separate thing from loving her, but one and the same thing, part of knowing who she was and choosing to stand beside all of it. One evening in the summer of 1876, with Eleanor asleep in her basket and James theoretically asleep but audibly not so in the bedroom, and the fire low and the July night heavy and warm outside, Clara said, "I have been thinking about what you said. About September 1873. Oliver looked up from the harness he was mending. What about it? About what would have happened if you had walked away. She paused. I think about what would have happened to me, and then I think that I am grateful, of course I am, more than I can say, but I want you to know that I am more grateful for what came after than for the rescue itself. He set down the harness. What do you mean? I mean, she said carefully, that being rescued from something terrible is one thing. Anyone with decency and courage could have done what you did that day. But what you have done every day after, the way you have listened, and the way you have taken my work seriously, and the way you have built a life that has room in it for all of me, not just the parts that are easy or convenient. She looked at the low fire. That is not a thing that just any man would do, that is specifically you. Oliver was quiet for a moment, holding what she had said. You have made me better at it, he said. At all of it, at paying attention and at staying honest and at knowing what matters. You have made me better at being a person, Clara. She smiled at the fire. We are very good for each other, she said. We are, he agreed and picked up the harness again, and the night settled around them, warm and complete. Burl Gaines left the county in the winter of 1876, which was the definitive end of that particular thread of concern. He sold the Gaines Ranch to a consortium of investors from Chicago who wanted to run cattle at scale, and he went somewhere east, Denver perhaps, and was not spoken of again in Caldwell with any particular frequency. Oliver noted his departure with the understated relief of a man who has carried a low-grade wariness for 3 years and is glad to put it down. The land was unambiguously theirs. The house was solid and the farm was growing and the children were healthy and the people around them were their neighbors and their friends, which is everything a person can reasonably ask for on the wide Kansas plain. By the autumn of 1876, 3 years after that September morning, when Oliver Bristol had walked toward a crowd out of pure instinctive conscience and changed the entire course of 2 lives, the 40 acres south of Caldwell was a working ranch with 40 cattle, a solid house with a west-facing porch and windows in every room, a kitchen garden that Clara had extended over 3 seasons into a proper kitchen farm, a barn with good horses in it, and a bunkhouse where Bobby Sanchez lived and worked with the cheerful competence that had made him indispensable. On the front porch in the October evenings, when the children were in bed and the dog was on the rug inside, Oliver and Clara sat in their wooden chairs and watched the sky do its western performance, the colors coming in from the horizon like something being poured slowly over the edge of the world, orange and rose and the deep violet that came after, and the first stars appearing one at a time in the east like quiet punctuation. They sat in the way that 2 people sit who have no need to fill the silence because the silence itself is something they have built together, full of shared seasons and remembered conversations and the particular history of 2 people who began with $112 and a pair of rope-burned wrists and made from that beginning something lasting and true. What are you thinking? Clara asked one evening, her voice low. That I would do it again, Oliver said. Every part of it. The money and the land and the winter at the Circle H and the drive to Wichita and all of it. I would do every part of it again. Clara was quiet for a moment. The sky was going from rose to violet, the light changing by degrees so gradual you could not mark the exact moment of each shift, only look up and discover that the world had become something different without announcing itself. I know you would, she said. That is why I love you. He reached across between the chairs and found her hand, and she gave it, and they sat in the October dark of the frontier with the prairie spreading out before them in every direction, large and free and patient, the same prairie that had watched them find each other, that had held the fire on their first night, and the road between 2 towns in the spring on the northwest corner, and the meadowlarks rising from the tall grass every morning. The stars came in their full numbers, and the night went deep around the house that Oliver had built and Clara had made a home, and inside it their children slept the complete sleep of children who have never known a reason not to, and the dog breathed on the hearth rug, and the fire went slowly to coals, And Oliver Bristol and Clara Fletcher Bristol sat in the great quiet of a life fully lived and held on to each other's hands as the frontier sky wheeled slowly overhead and the world, having finally arranged itself correctly, was content to let them stay. There was nothing left unfinished between them. There was nothing waiting to be resolved. There was only the 40 acres and the west-facing porch, and the two of them, grown together like two trees from unexpected soil, and all the years ahead of them still to come. And that was, in every way that mattered, exactly enough.